If a little green is good, more is even better. Now, back to Green is Good with John Shigarian and Mike Brady.
Welcome back to Green is Good, and we're so honored today to have George Black on with us. George is the executive editor of the NRDC's great OnEarth magazine, which you can also find at onearth.org. Welcome to Green is Good, George Black.
Thank you so much. Nice to be with you.
Hey, George, your magazine is a must-read for anyone who cares about the planet, and it's just chock full of great information and great articles, and Mike and I are huge fans, obviously, but, there's so much to talk about today, but we want to give you the platform because you're doing all this great work, and you get to travel and really report on a lot of great issues. Talk a little bit today about this whole issue since oil is somewhere about $110 a barrel or something. Let's talk a little bit about climate change and what's going on and how, the world is changing in front of us and how we could all be part of the solution here as the climate change movement continues.
Well, I do get to travel a lot, and I'm lucky in that respect, and I've seen over the years a lot of the ways in which I think you ask yourself a big question, which is, can people understand this properly until it actually hits them directly? And I think that's something that's hard for us in this country, but if you go somewhere like Bangladesh, people say, I can't grow my rice anymore. Why is that? Because the salt's coming into my fields from the ocean rising. You talk to people in Peru, and they say, my potatoes don't grow in that field, they grow in a different field, and I've got these bugs I didn't used to have eating my potatoes. Oh. Why is that? Because the glaciers are melting, they're losing water, the temperatures are rising. So these people experience this very viscerally. That does not necessarily mean that they know the language, the terminology. They know the weather is weird. They know they're not able to farm their crops. And primarily we're talking about people who live by farming crops. They're the ones who are worst hit because everything in their lives is dependent upon climate. But they're not going to sit down and give you theoretical speeches or scientific, documentaries to watch. They just know viscerally. Sometimes they'll even say, a lot of people I interviewed in Bangladesh will say it's the will of God. And then what you have to bring in then is the educational component, which fortunately in Bangladesh they have tremendous numbers of very smart NGOs who are using things like cell phone technology to take people from understanding that this isn't an act of God, it's an act of man, it has reasons that can be understood, and it has ways in which you can respond. So, I see a lot of things, obviously, that are disturbing and distressing, but you also see a lot of things in the field that are very inspiring.
So where are we in, so many of the great thought leaders that come on our show impress upon Mike and I that there's no one silver bullet, that this is a process. With regards to climate change, George, where are we in the evolution, in the process of all of us trying to participate and becoming part of the solution, and what's going on right now as we sit?
Well, the easy answer to that, or the glib answer, is we're not nearly as far along as you'd like to be. Somebody was making an interesting comparison to me the other day, which is the comparison between the understanding of climate change and the understanding of evolution in the 19th century. Okay. That at first, when Darwin and his ilk started advancing these wild theories, people were saying, no, God created the earth in 4007 BC at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because that's what the theologians say. And then gradually people began to say, this is for real. And then over time, the great majority of people say, well, obviously, evolution's true. We're sort of somewhere in the third part of that cycle right now, where the knowledge is pretty widespread. The understanding is a lot clearer than it was. And obviously, the main thing we have to contend with in terms of overcoming, the last part of the puzzle is that there are a lot of people who have made it their business to spread various forms of disinformation under the guise of skepticism or dissent or whatever. And that's consumed a tremendous amount of energy in the last 18 months or so. That really began, not coincidentally, with the big Copenhagen UN climate conference at the end of 2009, and it reached a crescendo really first half of last year, And then, of course, we lost the battle in the Senate to get climate legislation last summer, and I think the skeptics or the deniers or whatever they want to call themselves set us back quite seriously at that point. And what's interesting is that, going back to my foreign travels, among governments who are really concerned in the rest of the world, they're streets ahead of us. And that's actually kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And, if you're an American politician or an investor or a business person, it's kind of disturbing because China, ironically, although, it overtook us a couple of years ago as the biggest carbon emitter, because China is streets ahead of us, light years ahead of us, in fact, in developing alternative energy technologies.
Wow.
And so here we are now, we're producing more coal in order to export more coal to China, and China's going to be exporting wind turbines to us because they do them better, and they're ahead of us now in the technology.
What's wrong with this picture? Really?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, but let's go back to deniers and skeptics. Do you find in your travels the same denial and skepticism in foreign countries? Are they already adopting what is known to be true and making the changes?
I can't think of a country in the world where there's a significant number of climate deniers. England, maybe. England. There's something about the Anglo-Saxons, perhaps, that don't seem to get this. There's a powerful lobby there. It's more marginal than it is here, because what you don't have in England or Britain is a political party that is in bed with this stuff.
Right.
There was a very interesting commentary last year by the Pew Commission on Climate Change saying, the strange thing about this country is it is the only country in the world that has a political party, let alone a major political party, that does not accept the science on climate change. So the problems in this country are unique. Whether necessarily the lack of climate deniers or skeptics means that those governments are taking very decisive action, that's a very variable picture. You have, if you like, the usual suspects, the more advanced countries in Western Europe, Germany, Scandinavia, Spain to a certain extent, who are very, very much further advanced on employing renewable technologies and developing for sale and export renewable technologies. You've got a lot of other countries where the understanding is there, but the ability to respond and the material resources to respond are pretty limited. Again, to talk about Peru, they have a pretty clear awareness now at a government level, but they're not sitting in a poor country like Peru manufacturing solar arrays or manufacturing wind turbines. They're trying to get the basic infrastructure, so they have government agencies that work on this, so they have a meteorological service that even minimally tells them what's happening with their climate. So the more conscious the government doesn't necessarily translate into the best equipped to deal with the problem.
So it really is less a question of political will and more a shortage or a lack of resources.
Well, absolutely. Resources are absolutely everything in this point. Adaptation to the inevitable aspects of climate change, because many of them are now inevitable, and then mitigation of the problem of emissions in the first place, both of those things take a lot of resources. If you want to cut down on your emissions, you're retooling your power plants, you're retrofitting coal-fired plants with scrubbers, you're building new technologies, developing alternative ones. If you want to deal with adaptation, you're talking about, again, I'll take the example of Peru because it's where I was just a couple of months ago. The responses to losing water are you have to build big new infrastructure projects to harvest your water. You can do a certain amount at the village level, but it's very costly, this stuff. Setting up a national meteorological service is a $100 million ticket item. Oh, now, that doesn't sound much to us, even in an economic crisis. To a country like Peru, that's a huge amount of money.
Sure. That's a good point. George, you have a fascinating perspective because of where you sit and what you do for a living, but also where you go to. So talk a little bit about take people a little bit now on the road with you and talk a little bit about the best and the worst. What is the most discouraging or dramatic thing that you've seen in your travels, and follow that up with some words of hope, and what's the most encouraging things you've seen in recent times in your vast travels?
Boy, that's difficult. I see so much. I wouldn't single out any one particular country where you go, oh my God, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. You see examples where there is a sort of direct emotional impact because you see these things so viscerally. In India, you watch, people attempting to get water in the Rajasthan desert, and you see them digging deeper and deeper into the ground and coming up with water that is undrinkable because it's so saturated with salts. And they're in the middle of a desert, and it's always been dry, and now it's 10 times drier than it ever was. Those things hit you very emotionally, but there are equivalents in any country you go to that's affected.
Right.
The inspiring stuff, I think we're in an interesting moment right now in transition, and I think those of us who write about this are very conscious of this. We've done a great deal to convey the severity of the problem, the human drama of how people are impacted. We've spent a certain amount of time saying, I was in this village, I was in that village, these guys are digging a well, these guys are, harvesting water in some imaginative way. I think we're now necessarily moving toward the third stage, which is to take the best of the initiatives that are underway and say, how can you bring them up to scale? In other words, how can you really harvest the best ideas and bring them to a mass market? And by far the most inspiring thing I think I've seen in that sense was a program again in India where a big and very sophisticated non-governmental organization called TERI, called TERI, okay. Is producing solar lanterns. Now, there are many, many programs in the world for solar-powered light at the village level. People are sitting unable to work, unable to illuminate their homes with anything other than kerosene, which is a health hazard. It burns your hut down. It kills your children. It generates huge amounts of black carbon emissions. So solar lanterns are in themselves a brilliant idea. What this particular group said is, an Indian villager cannot afford a solar lantern. It's $40. Some models are $80. It's a very simple technology. How about we rent it? Huh. And you install a battery of solar lanterns in a charging station in a village, and people can come and rent them for 1 rupee, which is a small amount of money that they can afford, a couple of cents US.
Right.
And they get into the habit of making the solar lantern program economically self-sustaining within everyone's means. And this program is called Lighting a Billion Lives, not a million, B for billion.
Wow.
And when you watch how it can take off and be scaled up village after village, you kind of think, well, that's not an overambitious goal. They're spreading through India very rapidly. They're now starting in Africa. So those are the things that inspire you, not just the local small-scale stuff, although those are often very inspiring, but the things where you could really actually change the game.
That is so interesting. Wow. And we're going to talk about some things here in the U.S., but then when you do a comparison between all these great countries that you either write about or your writers write about or that you go to yourself, and also the United States, which we all live in, work in. We talk a little bit about the similarities and the differences as to the response of the people to the problems that we have, especially climate change, of the countries that you see and the United States. How is the response going? Besides the deniers and skeptics, which we've talked about already, response now, how is that going on a differentiating basis?
Goes back to my first point, really, about whether this stuff affects you visibly in your daily life. I think for most people in this country, let's take, just for a start, the question of sea level rise, which is obviously one of the biggest phenomena that's going to change our lives. I think people who live in places like New York City or San Francisco or Miami, there is a great faith that we still have, that we have so much technological and engineering know-how that we'll sort of figure this out, and we'll throw money and cement at the problem and we'll fix it. That in itself may be a very questionable assumption because there are limits to how much we can spend, there are limits to our technology. What is the parts of the country where this affects people more directly, I think, are very much in the West. The West is suffering the impact much more directly, particularly in drought. The drought in the desert Southwest is now basically a decade old. You've got levels of water in the huge reservoirs like Lake Powell, Lake Mead on the Colorado River, which are simply collapsing. I think a lot of people listening to this show have probably seen the famous photographs of the white bathtub rings around those huge lakes, which are, tens of feet, tens of yards deep of just bare wall where there used to be water. And they're getting to the point where if they drop much further, they're going to start incapacitating the turbines, so the dams won't be able to operate. And some of the stuff actually, you tend to think, it's a bit counterintuitive. You tend to think, Las Vegas is the villain because Las Vegas is sucking up all this water for, neon signs and whatever. In fact, Las Vegas has a very, very interesting water district manager who is bringing in a lot of new rules to regulate how people can water their lawns, how all the fountains at the big casinos and hotels have to constantly recycle their water. So, sometimes you think, that's an obvious villain, but it's not as simple as that. In other areas, something I've looked at quite a lot is the impact of both rising temperatures and drought on the great western forests, going from basically southern Colorado all the way up through North America into Canada, which are being destroyed almost before your eyes by the movement of this mountain pine beetle, which is a result of rising temperatures. It's really quite staggering when you go to a place like, anywhere, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, Colorado, and you see these vast acreages of red and gray forest. They're much worse in scale than the Yellowstone fires of 1988. But somebody said to me when I was out in Wyoming last summer, it's a slow-motion problem. Even though it is moving fast, the Yellowstone fires were all over the front pages of our newspapers, magazines, TV shows. This is much, much larger in scale, but somehow, again, because it's slow-moving, we don't react in the same emotional fashion, and that somehow... That's a very big challenge because we do need to. And I think, again, the scale of it, this is, I suppose, in a way, when you ask what is the most depressing, there is something extremely sad about not only seeing these great forests die, but also knowing that this actually is unstoppable. There's really nothing we can do about it.
If you joined us just now, we've got George Black on with us, and George is the executive editor of NRDC's OnEarth magazine, and also you can look him up at OnEarth.org. George, we could go on and talk about all of your amazing travels, but I also want to talk about what you do also besides being the executive editor of this great magazine. Talk a little bit about your writings. I've read your most recent article, The Plain Truth. Talk a little bit about how that came about and what you're discussing in your most recent article.
Yeah, The Plain Truth was a piece about a pilot that I got to know, again, through this issue of the pine forests and the pine beetle. A wonderful man called Bruce Gordon, who runs basically a one-man company, he and his partner and a couple of volunteer pilots. They're based in Colorado, and they essentially make the plane available to everything from school kids to environmentalists to local politicians, business people, to get an aerial perspective on what's happening on the ground. So I've flown with Bruce quite a lot over the forests, over the Yellowstone ecosystem, over the big natural gas developments in Wyoming. Gives you a unique perspective to see this stuff from the air. It's transformative, particularly for kids. Bruce is very, very insistent on taking a lot of school kids up there. He has a couple of programs he does every year. So again, he's a good example of the kind of inspirational person that you come across doing this work and you feel very privileged to have met. And not just a great individual, but what he's done with this thing is that he brings people together so that their skills can work in synergy. An environmentalist meets a scientist, meets a politician, meets a kid, and all of a sudden you have the capacity, to cross-pollinate ideas, to bring different skill sets in. So, yeah, that kind of stuff is really wonderful and a privilege to be able to write about.
George, you have such an important platform that you're the executive editor of. How does the process really work when making decisions on all the different problems that we have around the world? Some that need immediate attention, some that need, they all need attention on different levels depending on where you sit. How do you go about choosing the different issues to tackle in your great publication?
It's hard. We're only quarterly, which limits us somewhat. We have, I think, a stable of writers and photographers who are as good as any in the country. We're getting nominated for National Magazine Awards. We're being anthologized in the Best American Science and Nature Writing. We have a slew of writers who make their living writing for the New Yorker magazine, Harper's Magazine, the New York Times Magazine. We have photographers who do most of the work for National Geographic. So we've got the privilege of picking and choosing between some very good authors and photographers. I think where we see our mission is you have to deliver a balance of subject matter where your readers are most interested and most in need, expressing the most need for more information. We had a readership survey, interestingly enough, recently, where far and away the three things that people want to know most about: climate change, renewable technologies and energy technologies, and nature and wildlife. So we try to strike a balance among those things. We do a lot of hard science and technology reporting where we'll try to explain major trends in science and technology. We obviously, as we've talked a lot about today, do a lot of stuff on climate change and how the world is adapting to the realities of climate change. We do wonderful photography of landscape. We do essays about individuals' experience of a particular place or a particular ecosystem. So you try to strike a balance. And I think in general, we're very lucky that NRDC has seen the value of producing the magazine, continuing to invest, because it's not, National Geographic photographers cost a little money. And but I think in general, I wish we could publish twice as much as we do, but we try to do best we can. And
we're down to the last 2 minutes or so, and what I want you to just share whatever you want with our listeners, both here nationally and around the world, who you sit in a great place and you have a great perspective on what's going on. Talk a little bit about the future. You have a window on the future. What do you see coming our way, and what can we all do to be part of the solution?
Two things. One is just basic attitudinal. It's overwhelming. It's scary. A lot of it's very bad. Absolutely do not be overwhelmed or paralyzed by those facts, because the solutions are out there. The solutions in terms of technology are out there. The solutions politically are within reach, although it sure doesn't feel that way right at this moment. But trends change. And in the long term, I think it's a matter of timing more than of what will actually happen. I think the changes we need are inevitable. The question is how we get to them fast enough. But I think learn as much as possible about the solutions that are out there. The second thing I'm going to say is counterintuitive. The solutions to this have to happen on a large scale, and I'm going to leave you with a book recommendation.
Go ahead.
I would recommend that people take a look at a new book by Alexis Madrigal, which is called Powering the Dream. He's a senior editor at The Atlantic magazine. It's a very smart book, and it says, we have got to get used to the idea that the solutions here are going to come from big corporations. That may not be something that environmentalists initially want to hear, but the scale is such that they are basically the only game in town that can do this on a sufficient scale. It's a challenging idea, but we can't duck it.
Powering the Dream. We love it. And Mike and I are so honored that you spent time with us today, George. You're doing wonderful work. For our listeners out there, please go to 2 different websites, NRDC.org, and support the NRDC and the great work that George and all his colleagues are doing. Also, look at his great website, OnEarth.org, or subscribe better to his magazine, OnEarth. And again, as George said earlier, Powering the Dream holds maybe one of the keys to our future. George Black, you're a visionary eco-thought leader and truly living proof that green is good.
This program will be available for downloading in a couple of days from our station's website, keyword podcast. Thanks for listening, and join us again next week at the same time for another edition of Green is Good.